Hey fellow tacticians, be sure to like this video and subscribe and ring that little notification bell. That supports this channel's conservative content, which is good for me, good for you, good for America, but really bad for the dark cyber overlords at YouTube. So we'll go ahead and get started tonight. And when Billy and the others asked me to deliver a lesson and talking about the different attributes of God, really did seem fitting, because if we are people that are to love God, then we should have also a desire to know Him. When you love something, you desire to understand it and to know it well. And so it makes sense to me that this is something that we wanted to talk about. But I thought about, I don't think that we really talk about what this word actually means. So I would say, generally speaking, kind of looking at it, what the world thinks of, they would generally understand it as just kind of being a good person. And by the way, I'm not necessarily saying just because these are the world's definitions that these are bad things. I'm just saying that this is generally the kind of answer that you're going to get. And so I think that we can go a little bit deeper, because I do think that, of course, part of holiness for the individual is being a good person. But I do think that there is more to it than that. But I do think sometimes it can give a sort of negative connotation as to people will say that someone is acting holier than thou. What that means generally when they use that colloquialism is that somebody is behaving in a way that may be morally correct, but they're sort of using that to lord over people, or to say to others, look how virtuous I am and how not virtuous everybody else is, which is a concept that Christians should be all too familiar with. I mean, that is really the kind of attitude that the majority of the Pharisees back in the Gospels adopted. And so we can understand how people would think of that when they think about this concept of holiness. Also by Jonathan Haidt, who is a person that is a secularist and an expert in moral psychology and sort of the way that the mind works when relating to religions. And one of the things that he brought up is he talked about there being really 6 different dimensions of how people view religiosity and righteousness. And one of the things that he brought up was this idea of sanctity versus degradation. And he brought up that just about every religion, regardless of where it stems from, has some kind of idea of this idea of certain things being reserved and sacred and set apart versus things that are impure or degraded. One of the examples that he used really ad nauseum was that Indians have this idea. And from geographically, there is sort of this idea of holiness that is sort of ingrained into our being, and that we all, even if you are a secularist that doesn't necessarily believe in God, there is a sense that there are certain things that ought to be set aside and ought to be beyond reproach. And so this idea of holiness really permeates beyond just the Christian sphere. And so I really wanted to dig into what our understanding of that would be. So we could look at this idea of being sanctified or set apart. This is really more of the academic side of this definition. So when we talk about something being holy, we talk about something being set apart from everything else, that you have the holy and the unholy. And generally speaking, this is a thing that is said in religious terms. Finally, or also you have respected or revered. And so to say that something is holy means that something is worthy of our respect. And we would all understand this as Christians too. You know, this is one of the 10 commandments. You shall not take the name of your Lord in vain. And so there are certain precepts that we're very familiar with that would suggest that there are certain aspects of God when we're talking about God's holiness that are, by their very nature, they deserve our respect and our reverence because of its goodness and because of its inherent nature. And then finally, holiness could be something that is reserved for God. And so again, this is something that we could go back to the Old Testament and start to understand. So for example, when we talk about the sacrifice, the first sacrifice that is being made when you owe God the firstborn, that's something that we would understand as that is an animal that is reserved for God. It is something that is set aside for some kind of religious use or religious purpose. And so then I thought about, why don't we actually discuss holiness more often? Why is it that we in the church don't talk about God's holiness as often as you might expect? And I thought that there were a lot of different answers that could be presented, and I think that some of them actually do, in some sense, actually come from a good place as to why we're a little bit hesitant to talk about God's holiness. First of all, it can become synonymous with ritual. And if you look back at what are the holiness codes in the Old Testament, we can understand this, because we look at, for example, in Leviticus, These were things that the Levitical priest and the Jewish people would undergo to establish some kind of ritualistic cleanliness according to the Old Testament, which is not a bad thing, but it's also something that doesn't really relate to a New Testament Christian. We're made clean by the blood of Jesus Christ, and so we don't have the things like the sacrifices and all the very specific laws that we have to adhere to in order to be holy. And so because of that, I think that it feels a little bit Old Testament-y, if that's a word that I can invent right here as I'm speaking to you. And because of that, we may avoid the topic, not necessarily intending to, but because it kind of feels like it's related to the Old Testament in that way. It also can feel a little bit Catholic or legalistic, and so maybe because it has some ties to denominations, this is not intended as a jeer against Catholics, but they tend to name everything holy. Like they just tack the name holy on a lot of different things. And so to avoid maybe its overuse, or to avoid maybe it being a little too flippant, then we kind of try to avoid talking about holiness too much. And I think that that actually kind of ties into this next point of there is sort of an inherent sense within us that holiness should be used somewhat sparingly. And actually, if you look at the definition of holiness, that kind of makes sense. Because by definition, it is a thing that is sacred and set apart. And so because of that, we almost instinctively avoid talking. Go through this verse and see what things you notice here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Now I want you to go back through this verse really quickly and notice a couple things here that I've highlighted. First of all, it talks about the earth being formless and void. So in other words, you had homogeny. Everything was the same. It was formless. So we're seeing this idea of earth before God starts his creative process is it's almost like a big ball of nothing. Like it's just chaos. And so that's very interesting because a lot of times you'll see people talk about this concept of, well, everybody should just everything to do with holiness because the definition of holiness is to be separate or set apart or special. You can't be special if everything's the same. And so God's inherent holiness in nature is actually displayed right from the very beginning of creation. It is something that is inherent to his very nature. And if you think about some of the issues that we're facing today, and this is not something that's necessarily new to us, it's been happening throughout all of biblical history. You think about some of the things that people that espouse a more worldly worldview are talking to us about today. Do you notice that almost everything they talk about is always cloaked in this sort of veil of vagary and homogeny, kind of like what we were talking about earlier? Well, we don't actually know what a man and a woman is. It's just, people are all people and gender is fluid and all this other things. They always talk about it in these very abstract terms as though there's nothing solid or definable. We could see that in the marriage debate, for example. We don't really know what marriage is. Marriage can be this, it can be that, it can be this many people, that many people, it can be anybody. They talk about these things as though if everything were just kind of made fluid and up in the air and abstract, that the world would be better because it would be, quote unquote, more accepting. And then we look at that and we see the behavior that follows that being things that are, by definition, not sacred. So we would look at, debaucherous behavior and say, well, is anything sacred? Well, if you believe everything is the same, then the answer, of course, is no. In order for things to be sacred and to have holiness and certain things to be set apart, you have to have things that are clearly defined. God is a creator of borders and boundaries, and he doesn't do so out of maliciousness or to hurt us. He is doing so specifically to protect us and because it is in accordance with his created order. So we see from his created order that holiness is really rooted in God's creative power. It's not necessarily just a thing that's sort of hard for us to understand or define. It is something that really God is presented as from the very beginning. He doesn't just separate things and make them different in a sense. He also defines them. He gives them names. He talks about there's a difference between light and darkness now. There's a difference between water and land and all these other things. And so he doesn't just make them different. He also names them different things so that they can be defined. And kind of like we were talking about earlier, homogeny ultimately is chaos, and sanctity by its very nature, if some things are going to be sacred, they must have differentiation. So let's look a little bit later in the creation narrative in Genesis 2, verses 19 through 20. Out of the ground, the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle and to all the birds and the sky and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he slept. And he took one of the ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." So we're going to do the same thing we did beforehand, where we go back through the verse and do so with this lens of holiness in mind. So notice that Adam is now participating in the creation story. He's not just a passive being that God is creating. He's actually participating in the story at this point. And he is actually naming different things, which, remember, we were just looking at God differentiating and naming certain things, and so now Adam gets to play an active part in that. And then we see a little bit later that Adam actually also gets to name woman, and he recognizes that she is distinct from every other creature. There was no suitable helper for him, now there is. Why? Because she is, in a sense, sacred from every other thing that God has created. She is different because she came directly from him, as opposed to just being created by God like all of the animals. And so he's differentiating between the things that he's seeing. And so we're seeing Adam now take an active role in the creation, name things just like God did. And so in a sense, he's playing a more minor role, but he's playing a role in the creation story itself. And the garden is a holy place. It is set aside, just like everything else. And so you'll notice God makes all these things. He creates the entire earth. And then it says, and then he set a garden in the east. And so there is a sacredness to Eden. It is set apart from the rest of the world. And so there is a holiness to the garden that Adam is overseeing as well. So in this sense, Adam is a priest. He has been given a specific place like a temple that is holy and has God's presence dwelling within it, that he must oversee and take care of the things that are inside that temple. And so in a sense, this idea of holiness and priesthood actually predates Leviticus by quite a bit. We're seeing the parallels of those two things happen. And Eve is his sanctified helper. She is set apart from all of the other animals for a specific task, just like Adam. Now, she is under Adam's headship, but even Adam's authority is coming directly from God anyway. And so in a sense, both of them are acting out the roles that God designated or sanctified them to do. And so they have an active part to play in this idea of holiness as well. So now we're going to jump ahead to the part where holiness really gets kind of fleshed out and developed in the scripture. So of course we will be going to Exodus 3, 1 through 6, the story of the burning bush. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock into the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So let's go back through that first passage there. First of all, isn't it interesting that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire and burning with fire? That's going to be important, so I want you to remember that there's this symbolism of fire being used here. And then also, when Moses comes to approach him, he says, "Do not come near here, because where you're standing is holy ground." And this caused fear in Moses. He rightly recognizes that there is something to be afraid of here when he is standing in God's presence. So with that in mind, what do we actually learn about holiness in this first place where holiness is really fleshed out and presented in explicit terms here in Scripture? Well, first of all, holiness is exuded from God's presence. So that mountainside is not holy because it's a mountainside. That mountainside is holy because God's presence is felt there. Because this is probably a mountain that Moses has been on before. We know that this is a mountain that people have been on at other times, and it is not holy then. It is holy because God's presence is on the mountain. And this is something that is really explicitly stated more the later on you get into Exodus, where it talks about God's holiness being in the cloud and being in the temple. And so this concept is fleshed out a little more, but it's introduced here that ultimately holiness is a thing that is exuded from God's presence, and he is the source of it. Another thing that we learn, again, we see boundaries and distinction, just like we saw in the creation story. Okay, that ground, wear sandals if you want to, not holy ground. This ground, you take your sandals off because you're standing in God's presence. And so there's a distinction there. There's a boundary that is created that distinguishes where God is and where God is not. And also, God's holiness is good, but in a sense it's also dangerous, which is fascinating, and it actually reminds me of one of my favorite books of all time, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I love this particular part of the story. This is the first time that Aslan, the god character, is introduced in this story. And they're talking to him about who Aslan is, and he's the great lion, and he's the king over the forest, and all these other things. And at a certain point, Susan, one of the children, asked the beavers who were telling this story, they said, "Well, is he safe?" And their reaction is just puzzled. They're just puzzled by this. They're like, "No, he's not safe. He's a lion. Like, were you not paying attention? Lions are not safe things." And so they say he's not safe, but he is good. And so that's kind of this idea that is being presented here in the story of the burning bush, is that there is something that Moses is rightfully afraid of when he sees this. He is scared of God's presence. That doesn't mean God's presence is any less good. In fact, it's actually evidence that God's holiness is good, because Moses acknowledges that he is a flawed and sinful human being, and he is scared to stand in front of a completely holy God. And that is a correct fear to have. And so in a sense, the fact that, and again, I told you we would come back to this, the fact that holiness is symbolized as though it is fire is extremely important. Because fire is like that, isn't it? Is fire a good thing? Yeah, if you're cold, fire is really good. If we've all been standing around out in the cold night and need some heat, and there's a fire, and that's a very good thing. It is a life-giving thing. It can save your life if you could die from hypothermia, but if you sleep near the fire, you'll be okay. What happens if you sleep in the fire? Okay, well, you're not going to be okay if you try that. It's not going to last long. And so there is this similar idea between fire and holiness, where there is a proximity to where being near it is a good and a life-giving thing, but getting too close to God's holiness is actually extremely dangerous, not because God is not good, but because he is good and because we're not. And so that's really the concept that is being presented here. And ultimately, the message from this is men cannot approach God as they are. That doesn't mean that God doesn't love us as we are. It doesn't mean he doesn't call to us as we are, just like he did with Moses. But once Moses got to a certain point, he said, "Moses, you have to take your sandals off because you're approaching holy ground." Moses could get close-ish, but at a certain point, he had to obey God in order to approach any further. So, like fire, the proximity is extremely important here, and Moses was afraid of it for good reason. So let's look a little bit further into this idea of holiness in Leviticus 10, verses 1 through 3. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out of the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron,
It is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be honored. So Aaron, therefore, kept silent. So again, we see the symbolism of God's holiness being embodied in the sense that it is a flame. Now, that's not the only metaphor that works for God's holiness, as we'll visit in just a minute, but it is a powerful one that is sort of recycled in this story. And then later on we see those who come before God, he must be treated as holy. Now, what we're talking about here is that ultimately, when we're observing Nadab and Abihu, we're going to see why that was an important plot point. So if you go a few verses down into verses 8 through 10, the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. And so teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. So you're supposed to make a distinction. Again, that's what holiness is, a distinction between holy and profane, and between the clean and unclean. But my question is, why are we getting a lesson on the use of alcohol in this story? Doesn't that seem just a little bit out of place? I contend that the reason that that is included as a part of this is because what theoretically could have happened, I can't prove this, none of us can. I think that Nadab and Abihu were a little bit intoxicated when they made this decision. And ultimately, the lesson here, while the alcohol was a problem, is not necessarily about the abuse of alcohol itself. It's about the fact that they took their extremely important responsibility to be a representative of God's people to God as priest. They were viewing that flippantly. They just approached God any other way. It doesn't really matter if we're a little bit tipsy. It doesn't matter if we do things exactly the way God described it. No, it does. And they learned that lesson the hard way. And I contend the reason that God was so harsh with them with this punishment is because he wanted to communicate that to his people. You do not approach me in a flippant manner. And so, really, this story kind of illustrates the dangers of holiness that we were talking about. What was their sin? Ultimately, I believe, their sin was approaching God in a way that did not reflect God's character. If you understand that you're about to approach the creator of the universe and the person who is all-powerful and can do anything, you don't approach that person flippantly. And so that's ultimately the sin that they were engaged in. And one of the reasons I do think that he deals harshly with them, and this is a pattern throughout the Old Testament and the New as well, is God was always most upset at people that were supposed to know better. Did the sin of the Moabites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Philistines and all those other people, did that hurt God? Yes. Did it bother him? Absolutely. Did he call them to repentance? Sure. But he always got most upset with the Israelites because they were supposed to know better. They had the law. They had the revelation. And because of that, he was always more upset with them than he was the other people because they actually had rules and regulations and a special relationship with him that he didn't have with other people. And so in the same way, he did not appreciate his priests behaving in this way because they were supposed to know who God was better than anybody else, and they treated him as though he was not worthy of their reverence. And it also demonstrates to us that there's both sort of a ceremonial and a spiritual aspect to cleanliness, because they didn't do the ritual right, but they also approached him in a way that did not reflect God's holiness, and that was part of their sin as well. Ultimately, when we approach God and we do so in the correct way, it is an acknowledgement of his majesty and his character. We are understanding who God is, and our behavior and our mental state and our spirituality before him is supposed to reflect his identity. So let's go ahead and move on to a little bit later in Israel's history in the book of Isaiah, where it talks about another aspect of God's holiness. Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 7. In the year of King Uzziah's death, this is Isaiah speaking here, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. and the foundations and the thresholds trembled at his voice of him who called out, while the temple was filling with smoke. Then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. So what we start out with in this passage is that we are starting out right off the bat describing the Lord in his sacred place. He is lofty, he is exalted, he is on his throne. This is a picture of God's holiness if there ever was one. And we see a few verses later, the seraphim even are describing this and acknowledging that this is a sign of God's holiness, that the entire earth is filled with his glory. And so all of that majesty is directly pointed at God in this scene. And Isaiah reacts to this. We see him referring to himself being actually afraid, saying that he is ruined because he understands his own inadequacy before God's holiness. Because he is a man of unclean lips, he comes from a people of unclean lips, and it is only when God sends one of his angels with the coal that purifies his lips that his iniquity is taken away and his sin is forgiven, and then he is able to not be ruined before God's holiness. And what I think this ultimately says to us is that Isaiah really understood God's holiness. Because Isaiah, kind of like Moses, as we saw earlier, is rightfully terrified of this. And if you understand the introduction of that passage, recent events very much justify this fear. Because if you remember, it says that this was the year that Uzziah died. Do you remember who Uzziah was? He was the king that offered sacrifice before God and was made a leper for the rest of his life. And so if you understand that Isaiah is living in that time and seeing that play out before his eyes, you can understand why Isaiah is a little afraid of being in the place that he's not supposed to be, like King Uzziah was. And if you understand that, you get why he has this fear. But holiness ultimately is required to serve God, and Isaiah recognizes that. He understands he is inadequate for the job because he is unclean himself. He is not holy. And so here is where the very interesting development in biblical theology takes place. Every time we see holiness before this part in the scripture, it's almost as though people can be profaned by unholy things. They can be made ritualistically unclean by touching things like blood or death or any of those things. But there's no way to make that holiness contagious. But here we see a case of that. God's holiness is actually spread to Isaiah through this coal, and he is purified. And so it's kind of the reverse of what they're used to. Instead of the profanity being contagious, instead it is God's holiness that is contagious and has the ability to purify Isaiah and make him ready for God's service. So we're going to see another development in this happen through a different prophet in Ezekiel 47, 1 through 2, and then we'll also look at verses 8 through 12. So Ezekiel 47, Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, and for the house faced the east. And the water was flowing down from under, from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. He brought me out of the way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. Now let's jump ahead to verse 8. Then he said to me, These waters go out toward the eastern region and go down into Arabia. Then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea became fresh. And it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there will be very many fish, for these waters go there, and the others become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. Now remember, where is the holiest place to Israel? It's the temple. It comes from the Holy of Holies. That is the place where God's holiness is exuded out. And here in the symbolism that we're seeing in Ezekiel, there is this water that comes from the temple, and it flows out into the desert, out into the wastelands, and everywhere it goes, it creates life. This is creation language that we're seeing here. So you look here, holiness actually spreads from the temple. And the language of creation is being used here. It's very similar to the language that we see in the Genesis narrative, that everywhere this water goes out from the temple, you're seeing life crop up anew, that you're seeing trees spring up, and the Dead Sea is being purified so that there are fish living in it now, and all of this creation language is being used because God's holiness comes out of his holy place. You see, the desert is homogeneous. It's like the unformed earth that we saw earlier. There is no distinction there. But once you see trees and animals and all these other things crop up in this wasteland coming from God's temple, you're seeing this language of creation and this holiness being spread out through over all the earth. And the passage that is mentioned in this is the Dead Sea. So this is actually a body of water that has virtually no life living in it because of its salt content. And even that is being purified and being made into another Eden, as it were, teeming with life because of God's holiness. So where all this is going is that this temple is exuding living water that will flow out from God and turn death into life. Now, this should sound very familiar to you, and we're about to get to where that ultimately leads in Matthew 9, verses 20 through 22, in the person of Jesus. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will get well." But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." At once, the woman was made well. So now we're seeing an interesting turn of events here. The life is not flowing out of a temple like in Ezekiel, or coming from a coal like in Isaiah, but an unclean person, a woman who has a hemorrhage, is now being made whole. You see, a hemorrhage, an issue of blood, would have made one ritualistically unclean, basically in perpetuity, because you can't come in contact with blood and still remain ritualistically clean. And yet Jesus comes here, and just by her touching the hem of his garment, almost as though his holiness is contagious, she is purified from her infirmity. And ultimately, this shows us that the holiness of Jesus is able to cleanse other people. This is what Jesus came to do. He purifies sin from others, just like Isaiah. And like the holiness that we saw earlier, it sort of operates on proximity. The closer you are to Jesus, the closer to his holiness that you are. And we see Jesus cleansing sin, cleansing leprosy, cleansing death. He's actually bringing people back from the dead and casting out unclean spirits. All of these things were things that made you ritualistically unclean, and he is solving all of those problems. He is able to make unclean people clean. And I think that one thing that this kind of demonstrates too is for those that were unholy, that were unwilling to listen to him, that Jesus is dangerous to them, those that refuse to be clean, because we remember what happened to the Pharisees, to the Roman Empire, to all the forces that opposed him in the beginning. When they came in contact with his holiness, they were shown for being what they truly were. And that leads us to our final passage of the evening in Matthew 10, verses 7 through 8. This is just one chapter later from the verse that we were looking at earlier. Remember that. He's talking to his disciples here, and he says, "As you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you received, freely give." See, the disciples of Christ go out spreading Jesus' holiness throughout the world, and everywhere they go, unclean things are made clean, and life is restored. All of these are signs of uncleanliness that he talks about, this sickness, unclean spirits, issues of blood, all of those things. And the apostles now have the ability through Jesus' holiness to go out and spread that to other people. You see, like Isaiah, declaring God's word is a part of the purification process. They're going out to declare the gospel. Their lips are cleansed like Isaiah's. They're able to go out and give life to other people. They have all been given holiness, and now they are told to be liberal in giving that holiness to others. You see, just like the vision that we see in Ezekiel, Jesus is the temple. Christians are the water that spreads the life throughout all of the world. And ultimately, that's how we actually get to share a part in Jesus' holiness. And so we'll look at one last quote tonight by C.S. Lewis, which I think really kind of frames this in the proper context. So Lewis says in his book, Mere Christianity, "When you come to knowing God, the initiative lies on his side. If he does not show himself, nothing you can do will enable you to find him. And in fact, he shows much more of himself to some people than others, not because he has favorites, but because it is impossible for him to show himself to a man whose mind and character are in the wrong condition. Just as sunlight, though it has no favorites, cannot be reflected in a dusty mirror as cleanly as a clean one." So this really brings the lesson to where we have a responsibility to act. If we want to be the conduits of Jesus' holiness like the disciples were, if we want to be able to spread life and to spread the holiness of God to other people, we have to be a clean mirror, as C.S. Lewis puts it, ourselves. If we can clean ourselves and make sure that our life is free from impurities and lived in such a way that it reflects Jesus' holiness, then we will be better equipped and better able to share that holiness with other people, which ultimately should be the goal of every Christian life. Thank you so much for your time. We'll go ahead and call it there. Thank you.
Ever wonder where Superman gets his incredible powers? Some people say it's the yellow sun of Earth, but I think it's because he subscribes to this channel and likes my videos. Now, I'm not saying that if you subscribe to my channel you'll necessarily wake up tomorrow as a super strong, nearly invincible alien, but it definitely doesn't hurt your chances.